I'll never forget the exact sound the ring made when I set it down on the table. It wasn't dramatic like in the movies, no loud clatter, no gasp, just a soft clink, almost apologetic, like even it was embarrassed to be part of the moment. That ring had once symbolized a future, something solid and glowing. Now it just looked hollow, cold, final. I remember thinking how absurd it was. 2 weeks from walking down the aisle, and I was standing there, bare-fingered and heartbreakingly calm, telling the man I thought I'd spend forever with that he didn't deserve me. And the worst part, I wasn't even crying. My voice didn't crack the way it used to when I was younger, and everything felt like the end of the world. No, it was steady, clear, like I'd rehearsed this scene in my head, even though I hadn't. It just fit. You don't get to rise from rock bottom without learning how to carry your own weight. And Daniel. He had just proven he couldn't even carry a conversation without dropping everything we'd built. I thought back to the first time I told him about my past. We were 6 weeks into dating. Still fresh, still butterflies. I remember we were sitting in my car after dinner, the kind of late night where the windows fog up and the city lights blur into something almost romantic. I looked over at him and said, "I want you to know everything, not just the shiny parts." And then I told him about dropping out of college at 19, after my parents cut me off, about the man I moved in with, who made me feel seen at first, then smaller, then worthless, about the years I spent digging myself out of that pit, working 2 jobs, going back to school, coding until 3 a.m. in crappy apartments, with paper-thin walls and neighbors who screamed more than they slept, about how I rebuilt piece by piece until I had a career, stability, confidence, myself. He held my hand the whole time, said he admired my strength, told me I was brave. That was the word he used. Brave. What a joke. Turns out bravery only counts when it doesn't embarrass your friends at the country club, when it doesn't make your conservative parents raise their perfectly groomed eyebrows, when your story fits neatly into a timeline that looks good on paper. Because apparently, surviving hell only gets you so far when your partner's self-image is more fragile than your trauma ever was. In the days after I ended it, I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. There were moments of pride, yes, like when I emailed the shelter about donating the venue deposit, or when I packed my things and imagined Seattle's skyline instead of Chicago's familiarity. But mostly I just felt hollow, tired, like I had sprinted through a marathon of disappointment and finally crossed the finish line, only to realize no one was there cheering. My friends were supportive, of course. They all hated Daniel after what he did, but even they couldn't quite understand the depth of what I had lost, because it wasn't just a wedding. It was the belief that someone could see all of me, the scars, the mess, the fire, and still say, "I want you." I thought Daniel had done that. I thought I'd found someone who wasn't scared of where I'd been. Turns out he was just good at pretending. What haunted me wasn't his judgment. I could deal with that. I'd dealt with worse. What haunted me was the realization that I'd let myself believe even for a second that someone like him could be my forever, that I'd ignored the small signs, his discomfort when I mentioned my ex, the way he deflected when I brought up therapy, the slightly too long pauses when someone asked how we met. I'd seen them. I just didn't want to believe they mattered. But they did. And now, I was facing a future that looked nothing like the one I'd planned. No wedding, no honeymoon, no you Mr. and Mrs. signs on the front door. Just a moving truck, a new job offer, and a woman learning yet again how to start over. Still, starting over didn't scare me. It never had. What scared me was the idea that maybe I'd never stop paying for a past I didn't choose. And then, 2 days before I left for Seattle, I got an email that made everything twist in my gut again. It was from Daniel. He said he'd made a mistake, that he was scared, that he let someone else's words cloud what he knew in his heart. He said he wanted to talk, to explain, but it was the last line that stopped me cold. "I found something out after you left. Something I need to tell you. It changes everything." I stared at the screen. My breath caught somewhere between anger and dread. What could he possibly have discovered that would change everything? I should have deleted the email, left it unanswered. But I didn't. I couldn't. And that's when I made a choice I would later regret far more than walking away from the wedding. I replied. My fingers hovered above the keyboard longer than I care to admit. I kept rereading his message, hoping it would start to sound less manipulative, less loaded with emotional bait. But that last line, "It changes everything," echoed in my mind like a taunt. I told myself I didn't care, that I had closure, that I didn't owe him a second more of my time. But the truth? I was still raw, still bleeding under the surface. And curiosity, that ugly little weed that thrives in heartbreak, had taken root. So I replied, just one line, "Say what you need to say, but don't expect anything from me." I didn't hear from him that night, or the next. The silence made me think he'd moved on. Maybe it had all been another manipulation tactic, a final attempt to keep a hold on me. But on the third morning, with boxes stacked around my apartment and a Seattle skyline calling me from 1,000 miles away, his name lit up my inbox again. The subject line read, "About your past." I opened it with a sense of detached calm, ready to roll my eyes and delete whatever nonsense he'd cooked up to make himself feel better. But as I read, that calm evaporated. He told me he'd spoken to someone from my past, that after we broke up, in a mix of guilt and confusion, he'd reached out to see if everything I told him had been true. A pathetic attempt to validate his decision. He expected to find dirt, proof that I was lying, that I wasn't as strong or as healed as I claimed. But instead, he found something else. He found her. Maya, the girl who had dated my ex right after me, the one I'd tried to warn briefly when I saw her photo pop up on his profile. She didn't believe me back then, blocked me, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I sounded unhinged, desperate, just another bitter ex. But according to Daniel, she reached out to him recently, found his LinkedIn, said she heard he was engaged to me and wanted to talk. She didn't say much, just enough to make his stomach turn. Her words, he said, weren't angry. They were heavy, quiet. She said she wished she'd listened, that I had saved her more than I knew, that the man I warned her about wasn't just toxic. He was dangerous, manipulative in ways she didn't even realize, until long after the relationship ended. Daniel wrote that her message made him look at everything differently, made him realize that I hadn't just survived a bad relationship, I had escaped something darker than he'd understood, and that his reaction, his judgment, had been cruel, blind, cowardly. He ended the email with a simple, "I'm sorry. I hope one day you can forgive me." I didn't know how to process it, because on one hand it felt validating, like proof that I wasn't crazy, that my past did matter, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something I fought my way through. But on the other hand, I hated that it took another woman's trauma to convince him of mine, that he needed external evidence to believe my truth, as if my own voice hadn't been enough. I didn't reply. I packed the last of my things, locked the door to that apartment for the final time, and stepped onto a flight bound for Seattle, a city where no one knew my story, a city where I could, for once, start fresh on my terms. But even new cities can't protect you from old ghosts. I thought I'd left everything behind, but trauma doesn't operate on geography, and within the first month of my new job, I realized that while I'd escaped Daniel, I hadn't escaped the fear he reawakened in me, the fear that no matter how far I ran, someone would always see my past as a stain, that I'd always be damaged goods to the wrong person. I buried myself in work. My new team was sharp, ambitious, the kind of people who thrived on impossible deadlines and midnight breakthroughs. I loved it. For a while it kept me numb, but numbness is just delayed pain, and eventually it started seeping in. It happened one night when I stayed late, debugging a nightmare production issue. Everyone else had gone home. The office was quiet, the kind of silence that makes your thoughts louder. I sat there, staring at the screen, and suddenly felt this wave of grief hit me so hard, I almost doubled over. Not grief for Daniel, not even for the wedding. But for me. For the girl who once believed that surviving was enough. That if I worked hard enough, became smart enough, successful enough, clean enough, I'd earn someone's unconditional love. But love shouldn't be earned like that. And the realization shattered something I didn't even know was still intact. That night, I walked home in the rain, my coat soaked through, mascara smudged from silent tears. I didn't feel strong. I felt broken in a new way, not because someone left me, but because I had let someone define me. And that's when I knew. I had to stop running from my past. I had to confront it. Not for Daniel, not for Maya, not even for some closure I'd never get, but for me. So I made a decision. I was going to find my ex, the one I ran from at 19, and face him, not for revenge, for liberation. But I had no idea just how dark that rabbit hole would go. The decision to find him wasn't impulsive. It simmered over the next few weeks, each thought layering like sediment until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. Closure, maybe, or confirmation that I wasn't the same girl who once shrank under his voice. But something inside me whispered that until I looked him in the eye again, a part of me would always be frozen in time, 19, and voiceless. I didn't even say his name out loud anymore. In my mind, he was just him, the man who broke me. I typed his name into search engines like I was tiptoeing into a war zone. My hands trembled. Part of me hoped he had vanished, disappeared into some anonymous corner of the world. But another part, the part twisted by anxiety and memories, feared I'd find him thriving. I did find him, not instantly. His social media presence was minimal, scrubbed clean. But LinkedIn gave me a thread, and I pulled it until I found where he worked. A boutique consulting firm, still in Illinois, still using that same smug headshot from years ago, the kind of photo that tried too hard to look effortless. Something about it made me sick, but it also fueled something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger, not the screaming kind, the cold, knowing kind, the kind that propels you forward. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I booked a flight to Chicago for a long weekend and made up a story about visiting old friends. The truth sat like a stone in my stomach, but I was resolute. I needed this. I needed something to break this cycle. The day I walked into his office building, I felt like I was outside my own body. I wore a navy blazer and flats. Professional but unassuming. I told the receptionist I was an old acquaintance, passing through hoping to say a quick hello. She smiled, picked up the phone, and within minutes I was in the elevator. My heart thudded like a warning drum. When I stepped onto the floor and saw him through the glass-paneled meeting room, time collapsed. He looked the same, down to the way he held his coffee mug. Smug, one hand in his pocket, confident without cause. He didn't see me at first. When the assistant walked me in, his face shifted slowly from confusion to recognition, then surprise, and then an unreadable blank. He dismissed the assistant with a quick nod and gestured for me to sit. I didn't. I couldn't. The silence between us buzzed. "You look," he began, but I cut him off. "I'm not here for pleasantries." He raised an eyebrow, leaned back like he was still in control, but I noticed the twitch in his jaw. He hadn't expected this. "I'm not here for revenge," I said, my voice even. "I just want to hear you say it, that what you did was real, that you knew it was wrong." He chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that used to make my skin crawl. "You flew across the country for this?" My fists clenched, but I didn't break. "I flew across the country because I spent years thinking I was crazy. Because you gaslit me into thinking I was the problem. Because you convinced everyone I was unstable while you manipulated, controlled, and isolated me." His smile faded. "People grow up, Olivia. Maybe you should too." And just like that, it all came rushing back. The years of subtle digs. The way he'd mock me, then tell me I was too sensitive. The way he'd tracked my phone, read my emails, then claimed it was love. The time I locked myself in the bathroom for hours, just to feel like I had a moment of peace. And the way he'd always say the same thing. "You're lucky I put up with you." I took a deep breath. My hands didn't shake this time. I grew up the second I left you, I said. You've just stayed the same monster with better clothes, he scoffed. But there was something behind his eyes now. Maybe fear, maybe guilt, but I didn't stay to decipher it. I turned around and walked out, not with triumph, not with closure, but with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. I didn't need him to validate my pain. I didn't need his apology. I just needed to remember who the hell I was. And for the first time, I saw the past not as a chain, but as proof. Proof that I had endured, that I had chosen to rebuild, that the worst parts of my story weren't stains. They were battle scars. But the trip back wasn't quiet, because while I had expected him to be cruel, I hadn't expected what came next. The next morning I got a message request from an account I didn't recognize. It was a woman. Her name was Sarah, and her message was short. I saw you at the office yesterday. I know who you are. I need to talk to you, please. The pit in my stomach returned, because something in her message didn't feel random. Something told me she was his next victim. I stared at Sarah's message, the words pulsing against my screen like a quiet alarm. My first instinct was to ignore it, to protect the fragile peace I'd finally started to rebuild. But curiosity and dread gripped me like a vice. I clicked her profile. Nothing revealing. No mutual friends, no obvious connections. But she worked at the same consulting firm, same floor. Her profile photo was soft, professional, guarded. I couldn't stop imagining her sitting in the same meeting room, the same polite assistant escorting her to her desk each morning, the same slow descent I once mistook for love. I replied, "Are you okay?" She answered almost immediately, like she'd been waiting. "Not really. Can we meet? I don't want to do this through messages." We agreed to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop a few blocks away. I gave her a fake last name just in case. I wasn't naive. But when I walked in and saw her sitting in the corner, sipping nervously from a chipped ceramic mug, all my walls cracked a little. She was younger than me, maybe late 20s, slim frame, delicate posture, the kind of woman who shrinks to fit the space she's in. She looked up, recognition flickering across her face as I approached. I introduced myself, sat down, and waited. She didn't speak right away. She fidgeted with the sleeve of her sweater, her lip trembling slightly. Then finally she said it. "I think I'm with the man you used to date." Her voice was barely above a whisper. My chest tightened, the words threading through me like ice. "He doesn't talk about you," she continued, "but I've heard things from coworkers, nothing detailed, just warnings. At first I thought they were jealous or bitter, but then yesterday, you walked into that office, and I saw his face change. I've never seen him look like that, like he wasn't in control." She paused, took a shaky breath, and then I knew. You were the one. I didn't say anything. I let the silence settle, watching her unravel slowly. She reminded me too much of who I used to be, quiet, unsure, desperate to believe it was all in her head. "He's not violent," she said quickly, almost defensively. Not in a way you can report. But he watches everything I do, tracks my calendar, asks who I'm meeting for lunch. If I don't answer my texts right away, he shows up at my apartment. He says he's just protective, but..." Her voice trailed off. She looked away. I knew that look. I'd worn that look. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this," she said, forcing a bitter smile. "Maybe I'm hoping you'll tell me I'm wrong, that I'm imagining things." I leaned forward, my voice soft but certain. "You're not imagining anything." She flinched. Then tears welled in her eyes. "He makes me feel like I'm crazy. Every time I try to pull away, he gets sweet again. He says I make him better, that I'm the only one who understands him." I felt something deep and primal stir in my gut. Not just anger, rage. Not just for me, but for her. For every woman who had fallen into his orbit, hoping to be the one who fixed him, only to end up broken themselves. "I know exactly what he's doing," I said, "because he did it to me. And I know how hard it is to leave." Her shoulders slumped, like hearing those words allowed her to exhale for the first time in weeks. "But if you don't leave now," I added, "it gets worse, and then it becomes harder to recognize yourself." We sat there in silence for a while, two women bonded not by friendship, but by survival. Eventually, she asked, "How did you finally get out?" "I didn't even know I was leaving when I did," I admitted. "It was just one day too many. One comment too cruel. Something snapped. I packed a bag while he was at work and never went back." She nodded slowly, her eyes hollow with the weight of possibilities. "I want to leave," she said, "but I'm scared." I reached into my purse and handed her my number. "When you're ready, I'll help you. I'll help you find a place to stay. I'll even fly back if I have to. You're not alone." We parted ways without any grand resolution, but as I walked back through the streets of Chicago, something had changed in me. I had come seeking closure for myself. Instead, I found a reason bigger than my own pain. He wasn't just my past. He was still hurting people, and that meant silence wasn't just avoidance. It was complicity. Back in Seattle, I started writing. Not a book, not even a blog, just a document. A long, detailed account of everything I remembered. The manipulation, the patterns, the moments that no longer felt isolated. It was harder than I expected. Trauma, once unspooled, doesn't go back in neatly. But I wrote it all down. Then, after a week of staring at the final page, I made a choice that surprised even me. I sent it to Sarah, along with a message. "Do whatever you need to do with this. But if he ever hurts you, or anyone else, I'll make sure the world hears every word." I didn't expect her to reply. But 3 days later she did. It was a single line. "Thank you." I left him. I read it over and over, not because I didn't believe it, but because I finally did. After everything, something I'd survived had helped someone else escape. But just when I thought the past had finally released me, I received a letter, handwritten, no return address, and inside was a single sentence. "You think you've won, but I'm not done." My hands went cold, because I knew that handwriting, and I knew he wouldn't go quietly. My hands trembled as I stared at the letter. I wasn't sure if it was fear or rage pulsing through me, but my skin prickled like it was trying to warn me of something I couldn't yet see. That single sentence. It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration, a reminder that men like him didn't disappear when you closed the door. They found cracks. They seeped in. For hours I just sat there, the letter open on my kitchen table. I ran through every possibility. Was it real? A bluff? Was he actually here in Seattle? Had he followed me? Had he always been watching? I checked the locks. Twice. I pulled the curtains. I shut off every light and stood in the darkness, waiting to see if I felt watched. Nothing happened. But the air felt heavier now, like it carried secrets I hadn't agreed to keep. The next morning I called the leasing office of my apartment complex. I asked about security footage, about visitors, about the mailroom. They were polite but vague. No, they couldn't confirm who dropped off an envelope without postage. No, the cameras weren't placed near the mail slots. No, there had been no complaints logged recently. I was spiraling. And the worst part, he knew I would. That letter wasn't a promise of action. It was a weapon of uncertainty, a way to keep me dancing around my own fear. But I refused. I wasn't that girl anymore. So I did what scared people do when they're tired of being scared. I fought back, not with threats or confrontations. I knew that wouldn't work. He thrived on reaction. What he couldn't handle was silence, was being erased from the story. So I went to HR. I reached out to the women's shelter I'd donated to. I updated my work contacts in Chicago, casually mentioning that if anything ever seemed off, if he ever asked about me, they should let me know. And then I did something that felt so oddly mundane, so normal it made me laugh. I bought a new coffee table. The old one had dents from a move years ago, but it felt symbolic. Like I was slowly replacing every trace of the life I'd had before him. Still, the letter haunted me. Not just because of what it said, but because of how it made me feel. I thought I was done being that version of myself, the one who looked over her shoulder, the one who kept her phone screen face down, the one who flinched at kindness, afraid it might come with strings. But trauma doesn't honor timelines. It just waits, quietly, until you least expect it. 2 weeks passed. No more letters, no mysterious shadows outside my window. I let myself believe he'd given up. And then I got the email. It was from a private account. No name, no subject, just a PDF attachment. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I did. Inside was a scanned copy of a letter, one I had written years ago, to him, during a time when I still thought love meant surrendering every piece of yourself. The letter was raw, vulnerable. It was me begging him to treat me better, to stop lying, to see me as more than something to control. It was the version of myself I hated the most. Attached to it was a message. How do you think your new boss would feel if this showed up in their inbox? I sat still for a full minute, just absorbing the weight of it. Not the blackmail, not the content, but the realization of what this really was. He wasn't trying to hurt me anymore. He was trying to shame me. He was trying to pull me back into a role I'd long outgrown. The apologetic woman, the one who begged for mercy, the one who hid her scars and made herself smaller to fit someone else's comfort. I wasn't her anymore, so I didn't reply. Instead, I walked into my boss's office the next morning. I closed the door, and I told her everything. Not just the blackmail attempt, but the truth behind it. Who he was, what he'd done, the relationship, the letter. I expected discomfort, maybe suspicion, but she looked at me with something else entirely. Empathy. You know, she said, you're not the first person who's told me a story like that. And you won't be the last. But you are one of the few who didn't stay quiet about it. She forwarded the email to legal. IT blocked the sender. And just like that, what he'd meant as a threat became nothing more than a file in an HR folder. Still, I knew this wasn't over, because men like Daniel didn't stop when you ignored them. They stopped when the image they'd spent years curating started to crack. So I kept going. I started reaching out to women who had crossed paths with him over the years. Quiet Facebook messages, LinkedIn connections, a delicate dance of curiosity and concern. And what I found chilled me. I wasn't the only one. Sarah wasn't the only one. He'd left a trail of damage, subtle, deniable, but real. And now some of those women were willing to talk. Quietly, discreetly. We started documenting everything. Dates, patterns, screenshots, a timeline. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. But truth, when shared in the right way, is a form of revenge. And just when I thought we were ready to expose him, I got another message. This time from someone I hadn't expected. His fiancé. Her name was Claire. She had no idea what was coming. Her message was simple, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether to trust me. Hi, I'm sorry to message you out of the blue, but I found your name through an old comment on a mutual friend's profile. I think I need to talk to you about Daniel. Please, that name felt like a bruise I'd pressed too hard. For a second, my vision blurred, not from tears, but from how surreal it was to be standing on the other side of a story someone else was just beginning to uncover. Claire. The name itself sounded soft, naive, hopeful, like someone who still believed that love could be fixed if you just tried hard enough. I almost didn't answer. I was afraid of getting pulled back into his orbit, afraid she'd lash out at me the way people sometimes do when they're too scared to face the truth. But I also remembered the look in Sarah's eyes when she told me about the night he left her bleeding. I remembered my own silence, the way it nearly swallowed me whole. So, I responded. I told her I was open to talking, on her terms. She replied within minutes and asked if we could meet in person. She was in Seattle, too. We chose a public place, a bookstore cafe not far from my apartment. It was raining when I arrived, the kind of soft drizzle that didn't quite soak you, but still made you feel like the sky was grieving something. I spotted her immediately. She was younger than me, maybe 26. Pretty, in that understated way that made you think she'd never had to fight to be noticed. She looked like someone who smiled out of habit, But when our eyes met, her expression faltered. "I'm Claire," she said, voice low. "Thank you for meeting me." We sat in a quiet corner, and for a while neither of us spoke. I watched her fingers twist the edge of her sleeve. She looked like she was searching for a way to ask a question she didn't want answered. "Did he ever make you feel like you owed him something?" she asked finally. The question hit me harder than I expected, not because of what it implied, but because of how familiar it sounded. So I told her the truth. Not all of it, not right away, but enough. I told her about the letter, the threats, the past. Her face changed as I spoke, not into rage, not even shock, but recognition. That quiet, dawning understanding that comes when puzzle pieces start fitting together in a way you prayed they wouldn't. "I thought I was crazy," she said. "He always made me feel like I was overreacting, like I was the problem." "You're not," I told her. "You never were." She reached into her purse and slid a small flash drive across the table. "This has everything. Messages, screenshots, even a couple of recordings. I didn't know what to do with it until now." My heart thudded. This wasn't just more evidence. It was a lifeline. Proof that his manipulation hadn't changed, just adapted. Different words, same pattern. I promised Claire I'd handle it. Carefully, quietly. She looked relieved, but also shattered, like someone who'd just learned that the house they'd built had been on fire the whole time. After she left, I sat there for a long time, the flash drive clenched in my hand like a secret I hadn't meant to keep. I thought about every woman Daniel had hurt, every time we'd told ourselves we were being too sensitive, too emotional, every time we'd accepted less because he made us believe it was all we deserved. But the tide had turned. We weren't just survivors now. We were witnesses, and with Claire's evidence, we had a choice, to bury it and move on, or to bring it into the light, no matter the fallout. I took the drive home, plugged it into my laptop, and watched, listened, read. His cruelty was there, plain as day, in messages, in voicemails, in moments he probably didn't even realize were abusive. The gaslighting, the veiled threats, the control disguised as concern. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. This wasn't just about my past anymore. It was about protecting others from a future with him in it. So I reached out to a reporter I trusted, a woman who'd written stories before about workplace abuse and digital harassment. I gave her everything. Names redacted at first. Just the facts, the patterns, the emotional manipulation, the aftermath. She listened, carefully. Then she said something that stuck with me. "These stories matter most when they come from the people who lived them. Are you ready for that?" I wasn't sure, but I said yes anyway, because silence had cost too much already. 2 weeks later, the article went live. It didn't name Daniel directly, but anyone who knew him would recognize the breadcrumbs, the timeline, the details, the women, the patterns. It was raw, unfiltered, real, and it spread like wildfire. At first, I expected the backlash, the trolls, the threats, and they came. But what I didn't expect was the messages from strangers, women, men, people I didn't know who said, "I've been through this too. Thank you for speaking." Even now, just thinking about that time feels surreal, like I was watching myself become someone I'd always hoped I'd be, brave enough to stop hiding. Then, out of nowhere, came the final message from Daniel. No threats this time, just one line. "You really think you've won?" I stared at it for a while, then deleted it. Because the truth was, I hadn't won. I'd survived. And that was enough. But what came next? That was where the story took a turn even I didn't see coming. By the time the article went viral and the investigation launched, I wasn't the same woman Daniel had broken years ago. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't afraid. I was focused. And I wasn't alone. Dozens of women came forward, some anonymously, some with their names. Claire was one of the bravest. She agreed to go on record. Her evidence was undeniable. Every message, every voice memo, every deleted file she'd recovered was a piece of the monster's mask peeling away. Daniel tried to do damage control. Publicly, he issued a vague, patronizing apology about miscommunication and relationships that became messy. Privately, he was seething, threatening lawsuits, denying everything, blaming us. But this time, it wasn't a whisper war. This time, there was an audience, and people were listening. A major investigative outlet picked up the story, then another. The floodgates opened. HR complaints that had been buried, DMs that had been screenshotted years ago, women who had been forced out of jobs because of him. One by one, the dots connected. Daniel lost his job within a week. Sponsors dropped him. Clients canceled contracts. His name, once tied to corporate strategy and sleek success, became radioactive. His face, once a poster boy for industry events, disappeared overnight. And then came the audit. Turns out the company he'd helped build had more rot beneath the surface than anyone expected. Expense fraud, illicit bonuses, shady partnerships. The SEC opened a case. His business partner, his former best friend, turned on him to save himself. His fall was rapid, public, irreversible. The final nail came not from me, not from Claire, but from Sarah, the ex-girlfriend he had left bruised and bleeding years ago. She'd been silent all this time, but when the momentum became impossible to ignore, she stepped forward. Her story became the centerpiece of a televised documentary. She showed the world what he'd done to her, the photos, the hospital reports, the texts. Her voice, quiet but firm, shook the foundation of every lie Daniel had built. And with that, the narrative shifted forever. He wasn't misunderstood. He was a predator. Daniel made one critical mistake. He underestimated how deeply he'd scarred the people he used. He thought we'd forget. Move on. Stay silent. But we remembered everything. And this time, we refused to let it go. As for me, when the cameras stopped rolling and the articles faded from the front page, I wasn't left with regret or emptiness. I felt clarity. Not because I destroyed him, but because I had finally reclaimed the version of myself he tried to erase. I moved to a new city, quiet, by the coast. I started writing again, not about him, but about survival, about identity, about truth. My name became tied to something bigger than pain. Claire visited once. We walked along the beach and didn't talk about Daniel at all. Just life, music, books, the way healing feels like breathing underwater at first. But then suddenly you're floating. People who once doubted me now reached out with apologies. Some too late, some sincere. I didn't need their approval anymore. I just needed peace. And I finally had it. Then, one quiet evening, I received an envelope. No return address. Just a folded photo inside. Daniel, homeless, hollow-eyed, sitting alone on a bench, beard overgrown, clothes torn, a newspaper in his lap with a headline that read, "Serial manipulator faces charges in fraud, abuse scandal." On the back of the photo, someone had scrawled a single sentence in ink. He used to smile like he owned the world. Now he flinches when someone says your name. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I lit a match, dropped it onto the photo and watched him burn. And as the ashes curled upward, I whispered, "You were right, Daniel. I didn't win, I survived. That's what killed you.